The Centers for Spiritual Living Diversity Inclusion Commission welcomes you to Liberation Through Inclusion with our presenters, Reverend Rafe A. Ellis and Reverend Dr. David Alexander. Tonight we're going to be looking at liberation. Liberation and a new understanding of spiritual independence. Before we get started, I've asked Reverend Jeffrey to pray us in.
Thank you. It'd be my honor. So let's come together in consciousness. And I recognize right here and right now that there simply is this one life, this one power, this one infinite eternal presence that lives, moves, breathes, and has its being in, through, and as all of creation. I recognize that in this one, there is absolute freedom, because freedom is the nature of this one. I recognize that it is love, it is peace, it is poise. It is the consciousness that is back of all. It is the ground of our very being. I recognize that it is the who of who I am, that I am one with it, in it, and it as me. And so I know that there is no separation, there is no other, there is only this one power, living, moving, breathing, and having its being as myself and as each one gathered here this day. And I speak a word of blessing upon this gathering this day as we come together to explore the concepts of liberation and spiritual independence, knowing that this faith, this philosophy that we practice is a liberation theology, and it's more than just a theology, it is also a practice. It is a daily practice. There is the truth here that sets us free. And how grateful I am to know this, how grateful I am for each and every person who has said yes to this divine appointment this evening, knowing that the work, the Spirit within, does the work that is laid before us. And so I know that this evening unfolds under grace and in absolute perfect ways. I give thanks for it, I let it be, and so it is.
Thank you, Reverend Jeffrey. So I'm also the treasurer for CSL Diversity Inclusion Commission, and it is one of my highest joys to serve on this commission and to serve this organization. Asking me to speak up a little, so let me turn my microphone up. Does that help any?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Awesome. I'll just jack it all the way up. There we go. So again, I am the treasurer for the Diversity Inclusion Commission, which serves the whole organization of Centers for Spiritual Living, and it is a huge pleasure and honor to do so. Tonight, I am joined as my co-facilitator by Reverend Dr. David Alexander. And so before we get started, I'm going to show you and tell you just a little bit about him. I can click the right buttons. There we go. So Reverend David holds a bachelor's degree in child development and family relations from the University of New Mexico. He's licensed as a practitioner in 1999 and as a minister in 2004. In 2004, he co-founded New Thought Center for Spiritual Living in Lake Oswego. 2009, he was inducted into the Martin Luther King Jr. Board of Preachers at Morehouse College. In 2014, he received an honorary doctorate of divinity from Centers for Spiritual Living. In 2015, he was inducted into the College of Bishops and Affirming Faith Leaders. He currently serves, I see my slides are cut off, I apologize for that. He currently serves the governing body of the Association of Global New Thought. He's on the Leadership Council of Centers for Spiritual Living and the Strategic Alliance Committee, and he is the spiritual director at the Spiritual Living Center in Atlanta, Georgia. So why involve him in this platform? Because he is the perfect guy. As a social justice activist, Reverend David has worked with at-risk youth and served on the board of directors for the Community of Welcoming Congregations, providing a voice for LGBTQ and allied people of faith. And this is his quote: I am committed to the radical liberation of humanity through a universal spiritual awakening that calls upon our moral imagination and personal development. And so that is ultimately where we're going this evening. I'm going to start the process with talking about inclusion. Most of us, when I've talked with most folks about inclusion, what the conversation has really been about is the activity of including people. And that's not actually inclusion. That's the activity of including people. Inclusion, if we put it in the terms of our teachings of science of mind, inclusion is the effect. Inclusion is the outcome of what happens when we include. One of the dangers of confusing the two, and I'm going to go back to my slides here. One of the dangers of is that when we talk about inclusion, if we have an idea of an established container, then we are already including from a limitation perspective. Charlie, you got somebody unmuted. If you could mute them, that would be great. If I have a specific container that I'm trying to include people into, I'm not actually including them. I'm involving them, I'm engaging them, but I'm not practicing inclusion of who they may be that I'm unaware of, because what I'm inviting them to do is join my definition, and that's always going to be a limitation. Now, I'm a lapidary, and so it occurred to me that I'm going to use a lapidary example. And a lapidary, for those of you who may not be familiar with the term, is someone that cuts stones, turns them into polished stones or jewelry. So just looking at this slide, most of us just see a bunch of rocks. Now I'll go back to those shortly. The trick is that there is something really magnificent already included in that little pile of rocks that we don't see. And so very oftentimes when we are talking about inclusion, we ask the wrong question, because we typically ask, what do I need to do to get the part that is missing to come in? If we really understand inclusion, we know that everything we're looking for is already there. And what better question to ask is, why is it limited? What restriction is operating here that is keeping what already exists from being seen? And just like in the lapidary world, we don't add anything to the stone, but what we do is remove everything that doesn't belong. We remove everything that is limiting the expression that is already inherently within the whole. I've been really aware since this new upheaval, if you will, in our social fabric across the world, not just in terms of what's happening in the conversation about racism, but in our response to the COVID pandemic and just all of the social unrest. Hearing many of us default to the phrase to be for something and against nothing. And so I did some research on that particular quote, and I was kind of surprised to learn that Ernest Holmes used it one time. because I hear it so frequently, I began to understand it as this mandate that Ernest Holmes issued. And my experience is that's not actually what he was saying. And so I want to kind of look at this quote in terms of social activism, in terms of this idea of inclusion and how we get there. And so I'm going to show a couple of slides here and talk through these. The initial quote, he used it one time in the Sermon by the Sea, and he used it in this context. Find me one person who is for something and against nothing, who is redeemed enough not to condemn others out of the burden of his soul, and I will find another Savior, another Jesus, and an exalted human being. So when I read this statement in context, to be for something and against nothing is actually the outcome of being redeemed enough not to condemn others out of the burden of my soul. And so I looked up a couple of words in this statement. Redeemed means liberated, which is really interesting to me, and it just folded beautifully into what we were doing. Enough not to be condemned, not to condemn, not to denounce others. I am particularly struck with this doesn't say not to denounce behaviors. It doesn't say not to be against wrong action. It says not to condemn others, and specifically not to condemn them out of the burden or the weight of my own soul, which in Science of Mind in the glossary is beautifully defined as that creative medium, the mirror of our mind or the form. And so what happened for me in researching this was a deeper understanding, and that perhaps what Dr. Holmes was really teaching us is, if we lay this out a little differently, find me one person who is for something and against nothing, who is liberated enough not to denounce others out of the weight of their own thoughts manifesting in form and experience, and I will find you another Savior, another Jesus, an exalted being. And I know from reading the Sermon by the Sea many, many times, what Dr. Holmes goes on to reference in that sermon is and he says, when I'm talking about find me someone, I'm talking about you. And it's a call for us to do our work, to redeem ourselves from the weight of our own experience. And when we get there, the outcome will be one of inclusion, where we no longer feel a need to condemn or to be against anything. And for me, that's a very different understanding of that phrase. Now, I want to close out with this. We go back to the lapidary example, which is just quite amazing to me. And I get to do this from time to time. Before we get there, check out this quote. Every creation starts as a thought, image, or idea which exists in complete independence of the form it takes. This is the way the cosmic spirit works. It is our privilege to reproduce its operation in our own lives. Now, what that calls me to do is exactly what we teach, and to see what is fully present beyond the form, beyond the behavior, beyond my interpretation, that's the independence of our spiritual nature. It's not an independence from each other, it's an independence from the form, meaning that's how we're able to change form, is because thought created it, so thought can change it. That little pile of rocks, these are actually rough rubies from North Carolina. And when they were polished, they turned into this. And so if we will begin to remove those things in our thought processes that keep us limited, those things in our thought processes that create the containers that we want to include others into, if we can get rid of the idea of the limited container, inclusion will be the natural outcome. It must be. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. David.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you, Reverend Rafe. That was absolutely wonderful exhortation, exegenial, what they would call in theological school, right? The exegenial breakdown of the text. I love it. Thank you so much. And thank you to the Diversity Commission for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening with all of you, to see scrolling through the screen and seeing so many faces of people that I know across the country, and colleagues and practitioners and friends. And I'm sure many of you I've also met at conferences. Remember those? Those were quaint and fun, and maybe one day we'll get back to them. It'll be a blast to see you all again. So my thanks again. It's a great honor to serve you currently on the Leadership Council, and also to work closely with the Diversity Commission. I so appreciate the work that this body has done over the years in our organization. It's one of the primary commissions that we created 8 years ago. The other was the Growth and Development Commission that helped launch our original strategic plan. And then we decommissioned that body because it had completed its work. And this body continues because it's continuing to do great work, and I am grateful for that. This conversation tonight about liberation theology, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background and history lesson, not too much though, but enough to give you context for it. And then mostly to speak about how science of mind fits into that definition or historical context that I provide. And then talk about, what does that mean for us, right? In living out our theology today in the midst of the social context that we find ourselves in, which I think is the task of each generation, right? Each generation has to live the theology or the philosophy on their own terms in the world that they find themselves in. Ernest Holmes did that, and everybody who came after them did that. Him did that, and we are doing that in our midst. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, and I imagine leave time for questions and answers and all of that good stuff. Let me first start by saying I feel remiss that Reverend D. Jacqueline Edwards is not co-hosted with me. When I talk about the term liberation theology, she's one of the very few people that I've ever met in this organization that use it as frequently as I do in defining what science of mind is and what religious science is. As a matter of fact, I was I think on her ordination panel, I think it was, and her whole position and write-up of her paperwork for that panel was all about New Thought and science of mind as a liberation theology. And I thought I was the only one using that term. So, so she's my soul sister in that work and in that expression of this teaching in that way. It's always good to know when you're thinking and doing something and you find out that you're not the only one, right? It makes you feel a little bit better about what you're doing. So liberation theology, many of you may have some contextual relationship with that term as it relates to the Catholic Church, as it relates to the African American Church, or as it relates to womanist theology of late. All of these things emerged kind of around the same time, beginning primarily with the Catholic Church. Liberation theology was a Latin American manifestation, a response to basically to theologians and priests who found that the theology was not adequately addressing the needs of the people at the time. So in particular, Gustav Gutierrez is the primary articulator of this thing called liberation theology in a Catholic context. And then out of that, in response to that, you have James Cone, the great theologian James Cone, here in America, speaking about liberation theology from an African American context, and in response to primarily to Malcolm X's criticism of mainstream Christianity, and calling Christianity, you know, the work of the white devil. That was Malcolm X, not James Cone. And so James Cone wanted to respond to that and say, well, you know, what does the church have to say from the Black American experience? And how do we recontextualize it in that way? So you have Black liberation theology that comes out of that work, and that was in the late 60s and 70s. Women's liberation theology, Mary Daly, again, Catholic, along with other names that you might be more familiar with, like Bell Hooks, Bishop Yvette Flunder, and on and on. These different groups, so Latin American Catholic liberation theology, Black African American liberation theology, and womanist theology, liberation theology, all were kind of siloed for a very long time, and in some ways still are, but we're actually living in a time where there's a great deal of cross-sectionality happening, right? Actually intersectionality, another great Black feminist, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw is the one who actually coined the term intersectionality. So that's your little history lesson. So let me try to rephrase it or recapitulate it this way. All liberation theology, no matter which one of those you choose to study or think of, all liberation theology is an attempt to contextualize the Gospels or theology in relationship to and for the marginalized. Let me say that again. All liberation theology is an attempt to contextualize the gospel or the theology of that group of people in relationship to and for, and that's the key point, right? That the theology is for the marginalized. It's something that is addressing, it's to the marginalized. It's addressing their current social state, and it's for them. It's not against them. It's not something they have to live up to and become worthy of. They don't have to try to get into the kingdom. This is something that is for and about them, and it helps liberate them, right? So these authors and theologians and ministers were attempting to recast their theological constructs in ways that were for the oppressed, the poor, the marginalized, and lifting them up, right? So the second is that all liberation theology, the emergence of it, has always been a response to some larger dominant form of theology that in some way or another has failed its mandate, right, to essentially to liberate people, to liberate the body of people. So liberation theology, Latin, Black, and womanists all emerge as a response to the inadequacies of the dominant theological narrative of the day. They're defined by three major things that you might already guess. Solidarity of the oppressed, solidarity for and with the oppressed. Affirmation, so that's number one. Number two, affirmation that the state of oppression is not one's fate or natural state. Right? That'd be number two. They all affirm that oppression is not natural or God ordained. And three, they seek to unite the oppressed with the liberating power found in their faith story or their tradition. And so, by the way, I've been talking primarily from a Christian context. I do want to ensure you that you'll find liberation theology written from Jewish perspective, from an Islam perspective, from Hindu perspective. It's you know, liberation theology has gotten quite broad. It began in Latin America in that context, but has since spread out. So those three things: solidarity with the oppressed, affirmation that oppression is not the natural state, and then an attempt to unite the oppressed with the liberating power found within them and found within their within their faith tradition. When you look at those three things, it becomes a very interesting exercise to go back and look at the emergence of New Thought and discover that it does a pretty good job, I would make the argument, of emerging as a liberation theology. Now, solidarity with the oppressed is, you know, from simply a vocabulary standpoint, is we kind of get off to the wrong start there because our theology doesn't really use that kind of language. But there is an attempt in New Thought to have solidarity with all of humanity, right? That oneness principle. The solidarity is that we are all one. The solidarity is there is no other because there's only one thing happening here. So while we don't come from the language of speaking about the oppressed versus non-oppressed, there's a solidarity that's baked into the cake called New Thought, right? It's in there as a key ingredient. New Thought is also a response to the Calvinistic thinking that was the dominant theological narrative of the day. Calvinistic thinking, which was very judgmental, very basically, you're a worm of the dust and you came from nothing, you'll return to nothing unless you behave and do good. And even then, your chances are pretty slim because God's got a big anger problem and you got to spend your whole life trying to appease him. That was the dominant theological narrative that even Ernest Holmes and his family grew up in. And it was his mother who, after hearing the preacher be very particularly fire and brimstone one day, told him and his siblings that you never have to go back to that church again. Right, so that even that was the beginning of Ernest Holmes' questioning and thinking about things in terms of a religious and spiritual context came out of a liberation moment, right? You don't have to be bound to that old thought, that old way of thinking. So solidarity with humanity as a whole, affirming wholeness as our natural state is definitely something that New Thought is all about. And then attempting to unite us with that liberating presence, the I am that is within us. So in that context, we definitely can sort of recast New Thought as a liberation theology. Although at the next part of the conversation, I want to speak about the development of New Thought really begins as a liberation philosophy. And I want to spend a little bit of time making this distinction between philosophy and theology, and then come back to theology. We are primarily in our origins and in our application, and I imagine it would be true if we opened up the lines and let people speak. When we talk about your journey in this teaching, you would be referencing your personal application of the teaching, how it helped liberate you from doubts, worry, fear, error thinking, limited thinking, etc. Right? You applied it to your life. You thought of it as something that was articulated from the pulpit or from the classes or from the books as something that was meant written to you for you to help liberate you personally. Right? So it's in very much a personal liberation philosophy, because philosophy is individual. And philosophy is applied at the space of the individual, right? Philosophy doesn't really have any concern for the collective, except theoretically, but it's just something you do personally, right? But James Cone, one of the great Black liberation theologians, author of The Cross and the Lynching Tree, Black Power, Black Theology, and many other great works. Actually, in the end of Black Power, Black Theology, he writes about the distinction between philosophy and theology. And in there, he talks about how, again, philosophy is applied at the personal level, has no concern for the greater collective, but theology is all about the community, right? You break down the word. Ology is the study of or the knowledge of, theos, God. So it's the study or the knowledge of God. And the study or knowledge of God in the traditional religious speaking sense, it's about our understanding of God and James Cone would say his relationship. We're in a New Thought context here. We'll say its relationship, right? The relationship of the divine intelligence, its relationship to its creation. Right? That's what theology is. So theology is communal immediately. You can't have, it's kind of hard to have a personal theology because it's about the understanding of God or the divine intelligence and its relationship with its creation. And its creation is the community. Its creation is humanity. So it's communal in nature, right? So philosophy is personal in nature. Theology is communal in nature. So much of our teaching is written from the perspective of personal liberation, right? You learn the affirmations, you learn the power of your word, you learn how to pray, you learn how to meditate, you learn how to, be mindful of your thinking and your response to the world around you and shape those things and be a lens through which you may not be able to control everything that happens to you, but you can control how you think about what happens to you. And then you get to manifest your experience and shift and change things, and your relationships get better, and all that stuff happens, right? It's the manifestation of the 4 Ps, right? Parking places, palaces, princes and princesses, right? And so there you are, and that's all personal, right? That's at the personal end of the pool. But there is a deeper end of the pool, and there is a water that connects both ends of the pool. And I like to say, even when we're playing in the shallow end of the pool, I don't mean shallow in a derogatory term, I just mean it in a descriptive term, right? Even when we're playing in the shallow end of the pool, the water is still wet, right? Because the water is congruent all the way through. And the water is our principles. And the water is connected to the deeper end of the pool that is about our theology. And our theology is that solidarity with all of humanity. There's only one thing happening here. God is all there is. There's only one divine intelligence, and it is everything and everyone is the divine creative expression of that one thing happening. It is that principle that Reverend Rafe was referencing, the principle of inclusivity, which says that we don't have to, as my friend Sharif Abdullah says in his work, Creating a World That Works for All, in the first chapter, he talks about the principle of inclusivity. He says, inclusivity doesn't mean we have to like each other. I don't have to like you, but I do have to know and understand that I'm inextricably tied to you, and my destiny is tied up in your destiny, right? That's inclusivity. That's the principle of inclusivity. And that is at the heart of our theology. That's how we think about divine intelligence and its relationship to all of creation. And so when we talk about putting this all together now, liberation, the thing that makes me free, if I am applying the principles, I'm doing the work, I'm working on my affirmations and working on myself and how I view the world and how I think about the world and all of those things, the thing that makes me free is my use of the principle. The principle is universal. It doesn't belong to me. The principle leads me to the deeper end of the pool. The principle is part of the theology of oneness. And so when we talk about recasting what it means to be spiritually independent, I think or the independence and freedom that Reverend Rafe was referencing in the title of this, right? There really is no personal freedom, right? I can be free in my practice of the teaching, but the thing that's making me free is a principle, and that principle belongs to you as well. And so my sense of individuality is really an illusion. yes, I can manifest a house and a relationship and a job and a life and a career and a whatever, and be all well and good. But if I'm not understanding that the thing that I'm using to manifest all of that is connected to a greater power that's also creating, through its misuse, misapplication of the principles, is creating the oppressive and um, um, you know, states of injustice and in the world, to my neighbor, and I'm not connected to that, then what I'm really doing is practicing a philosophy of privilege rather than a theology of inclusion, right? I'm self-isolating and saying, no, me, mine, rather than saying this thing that I'm using is connected to everything and everyone. I can't be free until you are free. And I like to tell people that's why for those of you that know the 12 steps, that's why step 12 is to give it away, right? Because you don't own your sobriety until you help somebody else get it. Whew, that'll preach, right? That'll preach all day long right there, right? You can't get free until you help somebody else get free, right? Why? Because you're inextricably bound with one another, right? So we tend to think of our philosophy as individualistic in the application. But what you're applying is a universal thing that's connected to everything and everyone. There is no other. There is no, well, them over there in their consciousness, when they get it together, they can be as free as I am. No, that very thought is a thought of separation and is not anchored in the teaching, right? So I like to say that I practice a radical theology of personal liberation that teaches me how the world has been constructed through thought forms and gives me the tools to reconstruct the world through the application of new thought forms. So everything that's in place that is causing a mess in the world, from environmental degradation to abuse of men, women, children, animals, racism, sexism, homophobia, environmental degradation, all of those things, right? What, again, referencing my friend Sharif Abdullah, what he calls the mess, right? The mess, the whole thing is a manifestation of thought. And what Holmes tells us is what the mind can do, the mind can undo. So I have to take responsibility to contribute to the healing of the mess by putting new thoughts into the system. Because redlining doesn't exist unless people allow it to continue to exist, right? The school to prison pipeline doesn't continue to exist unless people continue to buy into the thought construct that holds it in place. There is no system of oppression that is happening in the world today that cannot continue to exist unless people continue to buy into it as an operating reality. So we have the power to liberate all of humanity through having new thoughts and enacting those new thoughts in the world. It's not enough to just get free, manifest your good, and stay private in your little corner of the world, right? Because you don't have a corner. So that, I'm kind of preaching now. I need to stop and I'm sure open it up to questions. But I think that's one of the things that really needs to get broken down in our mind. One of the things we need to get liberated from is this idea of the self-made person, right? The self-made man, the self-made woman, the self-made, we're in a season, a season right now here in Atlanta, right? We're honoring the great John Lewis and the Reverend C.T. Vivian, great men of great power and contributors to the civil rights movement. And there will be a lot that will be about lifting them up as these tremendous self-made men. And I honor their spirits and their contributions. And as I preached on Sunday here in Atlanta, these people had mothers. These people had teachers. These people had mentors and guides, and somebody who taught them the alphabet, and somebody who taught them how to use a fork and a spoon. And none of us are self-made. None of you gave birth to yourself, right? None of you taught yourself how to read or how to put on your clothes or how to, right? You're the byproduct of a community. And so we need to get rid of this idea that we can use this philosophy to become self-made people. No, you can use it to become awake, and then you can use it to live in such a way that liberates others, because you were one with them to begin with. All right, let me stop there, and before I get in trouble and they just cut me off and never be invited back again.
So not going to happen. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. David. So are you open to questions?
Absolutely, yes.
All right.
I'm ready for them.
So you can unmute yourselves, I believe.
They can also use the raise hand feature. They can also post questions to the chat.
True story.
While we're waiting for someone to think of something, let me just, I'm just scrolling through my notes, and I didn't scroll down far enough to find my final capitalizing point. One more Ernest Holmes quote in terms of contextualizing our teaching as a liberation, a form of liberation theology, right? Not the liberation theology, because again, we want to honor the Latin, African American, the womanist theology, all of the forms of liberation theology that are already in the world and are recognized as such. But when Holmes says that the ultimate goal of life is to be emancipated from discord of every nature, and that goal is sure to be attained by all, I'm not sure how you get a more coherent statement of liberation for all of humanity than that right there. And he's very, he's not like, well, that would be nice. He's like, no, that's the goal. That's literally the goal. Like, what's our gold standard? What's our moral impetus in our movement? There it is. All right. That was a little vamp so that you could think of a question.
This is Constance Chapman calling from Oakland. And I was curious, Dr. David, about the use of the word womanist theology, because I know bell hooks and Mary Daly both as feminist theologians. So I did a really quick look on the internet while you were talking to look at the difference between feminist theology and womanist theology. And I'm just wondering if you could comment on that.
No, I probably misspoke. I know them as feminist theologians. I know that there's a broader womanist theological movement, but I can't actually articulate to you the distinction.
Well, what I read on Wikipedia, for whatever it's worth, is that womanist theology is an African American. It's a broader, it focuses both on race, class, and gender, as opposed to feminist, which focuses primarily on gender. So that was, I just wanted to bring that up because it was really interesting to me to go do that little research and to figure it out, what was the difference there.
Yeah, and I didn't circle back on a point that I was making about in the 70s, all of these movements, which at that time would be solely identified as feminist, were very siloed. I think I mentioned that, but I didn't circle back on what's happening now, which is a lot of intersectionality that's happening. So you go to, so let's say Bishop Yvette Flinders conferences, and you find Otis Moss III and William Barber, and the works of bell hooks, and so there's a lot of cross-sectionality that's happening that is saying, because back then they were sort of fighting with each other, and the people in James Cone camp was saying, no, you got to look at everything through the lens of race. No, you got to look at everything through the lens of poverty and economics. No, you have to look at everything through the lens of gender. And now they're saying, right, we're actually it's actually an intersectional lens that you need to have. And each one of us have a unique intersectional lens, that we are a gender identity and a sexual expression and a race and a class and a this and a that and all of these things. And all of those things influence how we view the world and how the world receives us.
Hi, this is Reverend Jacqueline. So first of all, thank you for the shout out. Hi.
Let me bow to the greatness that is DJ.
And I want to kind of touch on Constance's comment a little bit, but I also definitely have a question. And so I'm going to say, first of all, most African-American women identify as being womanists because of our experience in the feminist movement, which for a long time was very exclusionary, meaning it was not inclusive. The vessel, thank you, Rafe, that was awesome, was not big enough to have us in it. And I think I'm not stretching it to say that Bell Hooks in particular, who is like one of the people I love deeply, would not object to being referred to as a womanist. So that's my comment about that. My question, and it's a question that I'm personally wrestling with, is how do we, or when do we, and it's the do we reach a point where we say, okay, I'm going to focus my work on those who are on board, who get what I'm talking about. And for the rest of y'all, you get here when you get here. And I'm saying that in kind of a almost sarcastic kind of a way, but I really don't mean it that way. But I'm wanting to hear, I'm asking about how do we move forward in substantial quantum leap kinds of ways, and at the same time educate, because that's what we're doing right here, and it's awesome. At the same time, educate. And what do we do with, how do we manage, how do we handle those who are consciously, because I believe we're either at or approaching a point where if you're saying, yeah, no, I'm really okay with the status quo, then you are consciously deciding to align yourself with systems that do not work for everyone, which means that really, no matter what you say, you don't believe that we believe that this goal shall be attained by everyone. So do you feel me? Do you get what I'm trying to? But do you see what I'm and because, you know, we've been doing this now, you said 8 years, the Diversity and Inclusion Commission. So what do we do with, let's call them the naysayers for the purpose of this conversation?
Well, let me see if I can put an even finer point on it, right?
I know you can, because you're good at that.
Well, you know, so this philosophy theology distinction again, right? Everybody who knows me knows I love a good Venn diagram, right? So you got circle philosophy, circle theology, and where they intersect. Our teaching really lives at the intersection of those two places. It is not exclusively a philosophy. And of course, it was written in such a personal way, right? When people say, what's the first book I should read? Well, this thing called You by Ernest Holmes. You know, it's not exclusively a theology. It lives at the intersection of these two places. And so part of this for me is as leaders, practitioners and ministers in the movement, we need to embrace the fullness of our teaching, not one aspect of it that we were attracted to when we found it, but the full scope of it, right? The whole depth of the pool and all the boundaries of it and all of that. And then bring that to the people, to the people in the pews and the people attracted online and all of that, and the readers and et cetera. And we have to face, right, the movement as a whole, therefore has to face an interesting challenge, which is that a lot of people, this is the Band-Aid we have to rip off. A lot of people are attracted to our teaching because it is or has been expressed to them as a personal philosophy almost exclusively, right? It's this place where I get to think, in a free, liberated way, and I can talk about oneness, and I hope humanity gets liberated, and I can, but really everybody's just got to do their own work, and so I'm doing mine, and thank you very much, and here's my 10 buckets in the bucket, and got to go, and that's it. That's what attracted to them, and I mean, I've heard it, right? I've heard it from people. Well, I don't want you talking about that social thing because that's not why I come. Right? I want a cute story out of Chicken Soup for the Soul. I want you to make a little tear come down my eye. I want to feel good and put my $20 in, and I am out the door. And if you're collecting for the shelter, then I'll bring some cans or an extra coat, right? And so we have to face that. That's a very hard reality to face, that our theology, our philosophy, and the fullness of who we are is much deeper than that. And it's my responsibility as a minister to present that to people. If they walk out or they say, gee, that's not what I'm really attracted to, that doesn't work for me. Well, there are other centers here in Greater Atlanta. They can find one that works for them. And so that's what I think as ministers, what we're faced with. But as a movement, we're faced with that too. And what if? And so what I hear you saying is, what if? What if the majority of the people say, no, actually what we really like is the individualistic perspective, right? Yeah, I don't know. I guess then I'm not part of that group, like, do we really divide over that issue? I don't think so. I think we've gone as a movement, I think we've gone too far down the road. 8 years ago was huge when we said our vision is creating a world that works for all, and that our mission is to provide the spiritual tools for personal and global transformation. Those two statements, and I say this all the time, they're voted by 98 and 97% of the delegates. The people had no idea what they were voting for. Right? It sounded good. It sounded real good. And we went, yes for that. Right? That because we are a wordy people and we love a good articulator, right? We love a good wordsmith, and we're a wordy people. And so when it sounds good, we can get a yes. And it sounded good to us. But the radical implication of those two things will transform our teaching if we stick with it. Right? The radical implication, because those two statements are inherently social and they're inherently justice oriented. So everybody who's in the pews saying, I don't want social justice to be part of my church. You've got a mission and a vision that is inherently social and inherently justice oriented. So what you gonna do about that, boo?
I just want to footnote that I do believe the majority are actually moving in the direction that we're talking about. And thank you again. Thank you very much. Yeah,
we just got to keep on moving and keep inviting, right? That's part of the inclusive, that's part of the practice of inviting, right? Not the principle of inclusivity. I love that distinction that Rafe made, but we got to keep inviting, keep an open door, and everybody's welcome, but we also got to expect that people grow and learn along the way.
Reverend David. Allison.
Hello, Allison.
Hello. So it's interesting that you would mention that phrase about personal tools for personal and global transformation, because as you know, we said that every week at church, and I remember it just being personal transformation.
Yeah. For
a very long time before and global ever entered into it. Do you remember what it was that flipped that? Was that when everybody started deciding they really did need to get involved in social justice?
That's a really good historical flashback question that I don't have a deep recollection of. I remember the part about spiritual magnificence came from one of our former branches, and the part about a world that works for all came from the other. And so there was a lot of, again, that wordsmithing of combining all the statements and then adding that personal transformation piece. And I remember using it at New Thought Center every week because I wanted people to understand the personal connection to why we were caring about a world that works for everyone.
Uh-huh.
And so that's why I really did emphasize the personal work, because I think some of the concern in the early days of this 8-year history we're talking about of CSL, people had tremendous concern that the emphasis on the personal was going to go away. Right, we're going to become so socially oriented that we're going to forget the personal work. And it's like, I keep reminding people, no, the personal, that part's never going to go away. Again, it's baked in. You have to apply it to your life. Demonstration is the only authority. So you can talk justice all you want, but are you living it? So you are the intersection. You are the place where it gets exercised and worked out. And that will always be the case. So I think in the early days, we were trying to emphasize that personal piece is not going anywhere. And I don't really remember how or why the global got added. I was glad that it did.
Yeah. Yeah. Me too.
Who knows? I may have been part of making that happen. I was on the leadership council back then.
Yes, you were. Made a lot happen while you were there.
Oh, well, let's not reference those things.
All right. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Hi, Reverend David. Oh, thank you. My name is Joyce DeFala. I'm a minister over in Santa Rosa, California. And thank you very much, both Rafe and Dr. David. This has been great. And Jacqueline, I'm reminded this continuum from personal joy of using the principles to social awareness reminds me of the continuum of what's called the 4 kingdoms or the 4 states of consciousness. A lot of us enter, because life is happening to us, and then we get all excited about, oh my goodness, I can use this thing. Life can be made to happen by me. And some of us get stuck there for a long time, but there is a natural evolution that leads us to, oh my gosh, this is a principle that works through me and eventually as me. So I notice that when I prepare a sermon, I try to remember the people in those 4 different categories and be sure I'm I have a little something for everybody. I'm also noticing that in our spiritual curriculum, there is an evolution as a person goes through for an increased consciousness and understanding. So I guess my thought is that we already have some experience and techniques for broadening a concept and kind of including everybody along the way as they progress from a more personal to a more social point of view. Thank you. I'm done.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you that the point of personal application will always be there as you journey on that and you move from victimhood to empowerment. You then get into the mystics of the teachings, right? You learn prayer and meditation for the sake of prayer and meditation, not to get something, but simply to be in that mystical state of awareness. And then you kind of rise up into that mystical state, which leads you to the oneness in humanity, and then you come back to the personal again. So for me, it's like a flow, and there are many doorways, on ramps and off ramps along the route, right? So people come in at different places, and historically, a lot of people come in because they're ready to do that personal work. They find us because they're going through some personal crises. It was recommended by a friend, or they picked up a book and read something and they wanted to be in community to help navigate something. So that personal part is so very important. We may find ourselves in this social shift that's happening. Younger people, we're always talking about millennials and Gen Z and all that. They're not so much concerned about the personal work right now. They want to do the social work, right? So when people say, well, we want to, how do we attract them? Well, don't tell them about personal classes of, changing your personal whatever. Like they're not too interested in that, right? They're really interested on the collective. And so we may find ways to attract different audiences by how we show up.
Good evening, Dr. David. Dr. David, this is Chiquita Isom.
Hello.
Hello. I'm in Colorado Springs at CSLCS.
Wonderful.
And I am interested in, because my feeling is being these teachings is that this is who we are. It's not just like you were saying earlier, come in, put your 20 in the pot and then move on. But my perspective and my feeling is that this is who I am. And when you get to that 12th step, even though I haven't been in a 12th step, but using that analogy, it is time because of the way social events have evolved. It's like all of these events in succession, the COVID that made us sit down and say, look at what's important, and it's not all of those things out there, and take a deeper look inside. And then with George Foreman, and no one wanted him to be the sacrificial lamb, but that's just how the universe set that and put that 17-year-old girl there in order to give witness to that, not just for us here at CSL or in America, but this was global. And it shook the consciousness globally, which gives me the thought process of the spiral that we talk about in religious science of moving upward, that we are on that spiral and we are moving upward. And our next step is to move this into society and saying that not only, and someone said it really good the other day, that the lives in America or the society in America was built on the slaves, the Black people and the brown people. And in saying Black Lives Matter doesn't mean that others don't, but when they are in the position to stand, then they raise everything and the entire society with them, because you feel that sense of fullness. And my question is, how are we moving into society to integrate this in that time when society is begging for this level of understanding? And not just in America, they're not revolting against just whatever, but against society, period. They're saying whatever this is in place, it has been shaken to the foundations, and it is on us to move into that space and say, these are answers to help in rebuilding and restructuring what is. And how do we begin moving into those spaces?
Yeah. Those are great questions. I know there's been some chat. I'm trying to keep up with it, talking about many communities that are actively engaged and doing work in their local communities. So that is one way. But I think a greater point that you're making is that this is, I believe, a tremendous opportunity for the New Thought movement, CSL in particular, to step up to the plate and, start offering some consciousness 101, like, the title of it used to be the subtitle of the practitioner, year one, right? How life got to be this way, right? Like, this is what the world is asking to understand right now. How did life get to be this way? And our theology has an answer to that, which is error thinking produces error results, right? When you think separation, you get separation. When you think superiority, you get division. When you think, we've been thinking these things, separation and not enoughness and a scarcity and all of these things for 400 years. And it has created an environment that is unsustainable. But the good news is everything that the mind can do, the mind can undo. And we can have a new thought. But that process of healing is a process of reclamation, right? And you have to first face what has been presented to you. I see Tracy Brown on here, and when I was on her webinar, she did a great series the last couple of weeks. And one of the things I mentioned there is when you state a truth, right? When you do an affirmation, let's take it out of this topic right now. let's talk about prosperity or relationships or anything, health, and you say your affirmation, right? Foundations class tells you do that affirmation 100 times a day, twice a day. You're doing that affirmation, do that affirmation. It's a steady drip of truth, right? It's a steady drip, steady drip, steady drip. Eventually that steady drip gets down and gets underneath and lifts up all of the crud, right? All of the sediment that has been at the bottom of the years, the decades, the conditioned thinking, the stuff your mama told you, and all of that stuff gets lifted up and broken up and then begins to float to the surface. And now you have to look at it because it's floated up and it's right there. And you have to decide, do I keep this in the container or do I get it out and keep putting that steady drip in? The two things cannot stay. It's got to be one or the other, right? Continue the steady drip or go, oh yeah, that is the truth. That's always been the truth about me, that limiting thought. I got to pick one. We know that. We know that that's the process. We teach this all the time. It's no different in our collective social state right now. That's what's happening. We've been affirming, let there be peace on earth, let it begin with me, a world that works for all of these wonderful things for decades. And here we are looking at the sediment that has risen to the surface for us to reconcile with. It's our work to do. And so
Dr. David, Taylor has had his or her hand up for a really long time.
Oh, okay. I can't see him.
So,
Hi, thank you.
mhm.
Dr. David, before I moved to Savannah, I was a member of Spiritual Living Center of Atlanta. And this is my concern. I'm a PhD prepared nurse. I used to be a substance abuse counselor. I've done a lot of things. And the question that I got a lot of times from people who had problems with substance use was, well, you know, you're not in recovery, and so you can't understand if you've not experienced that. And similarly, I've had white friends that say, well, I can't imagine how that must feel, and I can't imagine what it means to be Black. So for me, the unifying factor, we talk about mind and thought, is heart and love. And I think at this point, we need to open our consciousness about what love really is, and that it's not syrupy. It's the motivating, the catalyst for desire, and what gets us to do the things we know we need to do. And so I was just going to ask you if you could expand on how we can make that. And to me, love is the first motion. It's the quickening motion. And it's the motion that enables our minds to function at their highest capacity. So I was just wanting you to.
Well, yeah, I think what I hear you saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, you know, because of that intersectionality we were talking about earlier, right? I can't know,
right.
know Reverend Rafe's experience, right? I just can't. I can't know Dee Jacqueline's experience. I can only know mine. And so one, we have to empower each of us to be authors of our own story and speak from our experience, and knowing that when we're speaking in our communities, we're speaking into a community of oneness that will honor each of the unique experiences that we bring to the table, and that we're not complete without each of those things, those unique perspectives. And that what's underneath that, I think this is what I hear you saying, is the love ethic has to be the driving force, right? The love ethic that because love is in me, I'm compelled by love to love all of humanity. I don't need to know what it's like to have my child starve for me to not want my child or anybody else's child to starve, right? I can simply be compelled by love that says my child and every other child should have enough food to eat, should have clean drinking water, should have, you know, fill in the blank. So that love ethic needs to be what we speak about but not in, I guess I would caution us not to speak it in our pulpits or our centers from a way that is pejorative or dismissive, right? Not this airy fairy love, but a
Mhm.
love that compels you to move in the world. Love is a revolutionary act, right? Audre Lorde.
Exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree. I hope that addressed your question.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's a matter of, this is a personal thing too. I think that there's areas of, just like there are things we're learning mentally, I think we expand too in how we perceive love.
Yes.
And it's not stagnant.
Right.
No more than our thoughts can be stagnant. And I
It
think
knows no
that's
bounds. Yeah.
right.
It's always opening us further. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So next in
Thank
the
you.
queue is K. Whitefire Felkner. K. Whitefire Felkner is in the queue.
All right.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say I'm from Santa Rosa also, and I am part of the Being Belonging group. And Being and Belonging originally was called the Diversity Discussion Group, and then we changed our name because we realized that diversity was a given and inclusion was not. And then along the lines of what Reverend Rafe was saying, this, it may be that we change our name to something more like Aligned Together or something like that. I mean, the whole idea of us being more of the one. But I think the question was asked, I believe it was by Constance Chapman, that how do we really get this out in the world, and how do we address what's happening in the world? And also, I think, I can't read the name here on Scheherazade or whatever. So I think the important part is that we have resources available that are available to people that don't have the understanding that we have. So it has to be really on the level of what is. I distinctly remember being at a talk by I think it was Chopra. And I remember coming out in the hallway in the break time, and I was exclaiming about how wonderful all these different things were. And I realized with this blank look at the person that was looking back at me that I wasn't speaking at the level that that person was at. I was speaking at my come from. And so it's so important to have resources available for all the oopses and ouches and things that will occur inevitably if we are allowing ourselves, which we are, to speak up now. People are, even people that don't recognize what's going on and aren't wanting to align with it, it's happening. It's right in front of us every day. And so we are speaking, and also to get curious about other people, not trying to make them fit into our understanding, but get curious about the people as they are right now, as we are right now. Get curious, ask questions,
Absolutely. Curiosity is I think a key to our growth and transformation, right? If we're just curious about another person's experience that doesn't match ours, that doesn't sound like ours, that doesn't look like ours, to just ask the question, well, how can that be true? Right? How can this person's experience, which is so radically different from mine, how could it possibly be true? And just allow that question. Given that God is all there is, given that there's only one of us here, how could this experience be true? And just allow that question to take you, where it'll take you. I think the other, to reemphasize the answer to the question about how do we get involved and change things, or what do we do on the greater level, I want to emphasize, so thanks for bringing it back up, get involved wherever you are. Get involved in whatever's happening. If your center has something going on, social justice oriented, great. Book studies are a great place to start. Just continue the education, but then taking action and being engaged in something is wonderful. Every city, every major community has a Black Lives Matter chapter, a Stand Up for Social Justice group. And there are many, many other issues and conversations to be engaged in. Get engaged where you can and bring this consciousness. You know, CSL doesn't have to come up with the new thing, right? The new program that everybody joins. We don't need to be we need to bring our consciousness. That's what Ernest Holmes wanted practitioners to do, was get trained in the consciousness and then take your consciousness out into the world. And so be at the table. That's when I was chair for about 8 years and on the board for about 12 years of Community of Welcoming Congregations in Oregon. Many of those years we were still in quote unquote the fight for marriage equality, right? The battle for the ballot battle. And it was with a lot of great social justice people at the table who had a lot more experience than I. Coming from a conversation of us and them and the battle and the polarization and the victimhood, there's a lot of that polarized language in social justice work. So one of the things that we can do is we can bring a consciousness of wholeness, a consciousness of oneness to the table, right? So we were in just a quick story about that we were in that battle. We were going door to door, trying to get people to sign petitions to get the referendum on the ballot in the state of Oregon. And the conversation was, well, what do you do when you meet somebody, have a confrontation at their doorstep and all of that, and us and them, and what about those people, and all of that. And I brought in, it's interesting that Reverend Rafe started the dialogue tonight with that quote, right? I brought in this idea that what if we could be for something and against nothing? What would that look like? What is the principle that we're after? And that love is a principle. And if you're for a principle of love, then you don't have to be against anything, because the politics of hate cannot triumph over the principle of love. And I said, so what are we for? Well, we're for marriage, right? There's no such thing as gay marriage, right? It's just marriage. It's just, and so we're for that, and we're for love, and we're for people having that right. And so we changed the whole nature of the campaign because I brought that voice to the table, and we said, let's go door to door and let's just talk to people about love. And so we knock on the door and we say, hello. And we say, yeah, are you married? Were your parents married? Oh, you were? How long? Oh, oh, your parents were married 30 years. How wonderful. And we engage them in a conversation about what they liked and appreciated and valued about being married, or wanting to get married, or their parents being married, or whatever the case may be. And then out of a conversation of mutually established values, we then would pick up our clipboard and say, now here's Steve and Bob, and they would like to have the same things that you're talking about, right? But the establishment was on what we had in common and a consciousness of oneness, rather than, I'm here about Steve and Bob and I've immediately alienated the person at the door because they just can't get there, right? But if I got them to talk about their relationship, then we could get there. So we can bring that kind of transformative consciousness of oneness to the tables of justice and change the conversation. And in many places, the conversation does need to be changed. And I don't say that to denigrate any of the work that's being done, but to just say that we have a seat at the table and we need to take it.
Alice Reed is next in the queue.
Hi, Dr. David. I have been curious and a little bit challenged, because as we look at these ideas of social justice and inclusion, and these global ideas that we want folks to consider, these new ideas, as I can sense the evolution happening, I'm really challenged by the curriculum that we teach. The curriculum is very focused on personal development. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering if you could share some wisdom around that for those of us that are trying to move in this direction with the tools that we have at hand.
Well, I would just give you one tool. I feel the same challenge. I think there's lots of new curriculum that needs to be developed on this greater social level that follows the same pattern as our other curriculum, right? We just begin with understanding the vocabulary and the landscape of social issues. AG&T has provided some of that curriculum on social issues as a good starting point. They're not in-depth 10-week courses, but they've provided some really good content for having conversations and framing the topics. But one very simple tool you can bring into foundations or any basic class, which is, okay, so we're learning about the personal application. And I've always asked this question. It's the question that I asked myself that has led me to wherever it is I am today here talking with you. And that is, what is the radical implication of our teaching? What is the radical implication of this principle? What's the radical implication of the principle of prosperity? What's the radical implication of health and wholeness? What's the radical, and by radical implication, I mean, take that idea that starts at the personal level and then extend it out to the farthest reaches of your imagination, applying it to everybody along the way. You know, how does the ripple effect, how does it reconstruct everything if it's applied universally across the board? And you'll only be able to go so far before your mind just kind of goes, you know, tilt. I can't handle it anymore. And it's like, okay, stop there and do the work at that border. And then you come back to it again, and you keep going, right? So that's a personal thing that I've always done with our principles in every class, and that helps people take it from the personal to the collective. And yes, let's write new curriculum.
I think the other place that gets challenging is, I have some people of color in my community, and as I've been talking about racism and anti-racism from the platform, they've gotten really brave and come and told me, like, they don't see themselves in our literature. They don't see ourselves on the platform. They don't see ourselves in many of our musicians and our music. And so, how to be more inclusive when we've got so much traction from the early days and a lot of the literature that is very white, from the white perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a challenge that most of our communities have. It's certainly one that my community in Oregon had. I'm blessed that that's really not an issue for us here in Atlanta. But it's not just because we're in Atlanta. I mean, there's a history and a legacy that I'm standing on, and there are churches here of New Thought and of other types that are, exclusive in their makeup. So even in a diverse community, you have to be intentional about what you're building and creating. So I want to say that, but certainly being mindful of what you're representing on the platform, in the literature, in the music, etc. And what I've discovered is the more I look, the more I find the roots for bringing more historical reflection of the diversity of our movement forward. Our movement inspired Marcus Garvey. It inspired, Father Divine and the birth of the social gospel movement. It was a liberation theology in the hands of Reverend Ike, right? It was, Johnny Coleman was the first female African-American mega church builder and really empire builder in the New Thought movement. So the history is there, and we need to highlight and talk more about that. I wasn't taught those things necessarily in my classes growing up. I had to go searching for them, but I was happy to find that they're there. So I think that's part of it, is just telling a story. And, I know we're probably running out of time, but an interesting discovery that I made, which was the lineage of, Marcus Garvey, Father Divine, Reverend Ike. It dawned on me that our teaching in the hands of leaders that were people of color was always a liberation theology. Our teaching in the hands of predominantly white Anglo-Caucasian leaders was almost always a theology of privilege, right? It was taught for those who have, right, to get more. And so there is this, am I really going to do this with 4 minutes left? Am I going to drop this bomb on you all? I guess I am. I'm already there. There was this color line in our history, right? But what's interesting is the teachings are the teachings. And in the hands of people of color, it was always, this is not a new idea. This is not a new thought for new thought to be about liberation theology. For 100 years or more, it's been a theology of liberation in the hands of people of color. That's what they've done with this thing called our teachings. In the hands of Anglo-Caucasian leaders, it's been primarily a teaching of prosperity and privilege. Not exclusively, but primarily. So that's something we have to reconcile with. And maybe that'll be a topic of another conversation with the Diversity Commission.
Beautiful. So we are running out of time. And I want to offer, this may well be my favorite paragraph in the Science of Mind book, because for me, it brings together this whole idea of decision-making and application from the personal to the collective in one paragraph. So on page 270, and I'm going to read it in gender-neutral language, so it's not a direct quote because there's more than him in the world, so I'm going to read it that way. The criterion for any person as to what is right or wrong for them is not to be found in some other person's judgment. The criterion is, does the thing I wish to do express more life, more happiness, more peace to myself, and at the same time harm no one? If it does, it is right. It is not selfish. But if it is done at the expense of anyone, then in such degree, I am making a wrong use of the law. And so I invite you to take that with you in your application of Science of Mind. And I've asked Reverend Sunshine Michelle to pray us out.
And I think, thank you so much, Reverend Rafe. And I think we have a diversity forum tomorrow too, don't we? Don't you want to advertise that? Do we have one tomorrow? With
Yes,
Reverend
we do.
Michelle?
We do. Reverend Michelle, you want to tell us what you're going to be doing tomorrow?
Yes, I'm going to be clearing up our miseducation with regard to Black Lives Matter. So join in. It's not an endorsement, it's an education and clarification of what it is.
Woohoo!
Beautiful. So as we come together in our last moment of time, we just come around the campfire of God, where we are honoring the diversity, the multiplicity, the inclusion, the allness, the fullness, the glory of the divine, that everyone, all beings, are included in. And so we celebrate that, giving thanks for Dr. David Alexander tonight and Reverend Rafe Ellis, who have brought us wisdom and joy around these principles, and for everyone on this call who has participated, and whether you've said anything or not, your heart is here, your presence is here, and we give thanks for that. And also giving thanks for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Commission, and for Centers for Spiritual Living, and for all of us doing our part in the world to make it a world that works for everyone. So I lift this word in love, in joy, in harmony, in peace, in unity, and all the goodness and greatness that we can muster, and know that it's that times infinity, because that's how God rolls, in the goodness and greatness of it all. So I lift this word into the great ethers of divine law, know that it combusts with love, and that it manifests and just trickles and showers us with so many blessings, that we go about our way this evening in peace, in love, in harmony, and all that our hearts desire. And for this and the more, let us celebrate tonight together. And so it is.
And